Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Adult Sunday School for the Goldendale Church of the Nazarene. It is November the 8th, 2020, and we are still doing the Ten Commandments. So as we are getting very accustomed to now, I'm going to put myself in the corner and we'll get started. Today's lesson is called The High Cost of Theft. And if you have your lesson book, it begins on page 40. And again, even though my remarks are not going to replicate everything that's in the lesson book, I strongly encourage you to go through that book if you have it, because there's a lot of good stuff in there. But let's go ahead and get into the lesson and we'll see what we've got. But we, of course, want to keep doing this review, which I think gets more important as we get more and more commandments under our belt. So the first commandment, which was about loving God above other gods, it's all about relationship, right? God wants a relationship with his people, and he's telling us that we need to have him above everyone else. And the second commandment is related to it, really, because it's about idolatry, which is anything that you put above God. And what the real theme here is that the good is the enemy of the best. God is the best. Anything else you put in his place is at best good. It may not even be good, but it's not the best, that's for sure. Number 3, God's heart is to restore, not destroy. That has to do with taking God's name in vain, which, again, we wouldn't see it directly from this commandment itself, but if we look at the entire Bible, we see that God just has such a heart of mercy and forgiveness that even though we often not only take his name in vain, but we are poor witnesses for him. We claim to be his people. We don't always act like it, but he's there to forgive and restore us. So he is really not in the business of destruction. Okay, now number 4, the Sabbath. This is important. God has set up the pattern of work and rest. It's not something to be legalistic about. It's something that God has established for us so that we understand rest is good and rest is ordained by God. Number 5, in a similar way, this has to do with honoring your parents. God has established the parent-child relationship as a pattern for our relationship with him. He is our Father and we are his children. And number 6, we are talking about murder here. Thou shalt not murder, as the King James says. And because we're created in God's image, we humans are uniquely precious to God, and he is very, very much not in favor of anybody destroying someone who is made in his image. Number 7 was last week, and that had to do with committing adultery, and we saw a lot of different interesting aspects of that. So what we're really learning is that in breaking one commandment, we often break others. Now, adultery is just one example of where that happens, but we see this, right? You commit adultery, you're almost always going to lie about it. You're always going to try to cover it up. The other thing is you had to covet before you actually committed adultery, so there was that. There are a number of different sins that we end up committing. When we commit one sin, we end up covering it up with other sins. So today, here we are on the next commandment, which is the 8th commandment: you shall not steal. Now, remember I said I was going to use different versions of the Bible just so you got used to seeing different translations. And the one we'll be using today will be the New King James Version. And this was the one that I actually learned the Bible from in the first place. So a lot of the times when I have things memorized, if they're not the King James, they're the New King James. And they're quite similar, even though the language is a lot more readable for today's readers. Okay, so this I got from the Illustrated Bible Life Guide that goes along with the lesson book, the definition of to steal. And it says that the meaning of the Hebrew word to steal includes a sense of stealth, so secrecy, sneaking. It involves taking something in secret without permission from the owner. And the interesting thing here is that, and this again is from the Illustrated Bible Life, they say, well, there's no object that's stated in the command. So in other words, it doesn't say you shall not steal cars, or you shall not steal money, or you shall not steal whatever. Stealing in general is wrong as far as God's concerned. Any act of stealing is wrong. It's against the commandment. So by leaving it open-ended, it actually makes it more powerful and more all-encompassing. Now, I just wanted to point this out, that again, from the Illustrated Bible Life, every culture has prohibited stealing. It's not something that the Bible is unique in at all. Just about every culture says this, that stealing is wrong. Taking something from somebody else without their permission, whether you do it in secret or not, it's just wrong. It kind of breaks down society if you have that kind of thing going on, because stealing breaks the trust that people have for one another. It's awfully hard to have a relationship that's solid and built on trust if there's some stealing going on. And that, I guess, just makes intuitive sense, right? Almost doesn't even need to be said, but I thought I'd say it anyway, just because I think it was worth saying. Well, the thing about stealing, as we've looked at these other commandments that had to do with sins against people, murder and adultery in particular, oftentimes there can be restitution made for what is stolen, right? If I steal, I don't know, if I steal $5 from you, I can give you back your $5 and you're not out anything. Or even if I take some of your property and I can't give it back, or I don't give it back, or whatever, the court may assign damages that are monetary, which would cover the value of the item that was stolen. So unlike murder, obviously there's no amount of money that is going to bring back to life the person who has been murdered, and there's no restoring or making restitution for, I should say, adultery, because what can you really do? You can't uninvolve yourself with the person. You can't undo the damage that's been done in that way. It's kind of difficult to see how that could be. But stealing is different that way. You can, as far as the item itself, you can make restitution for that. Now, I wanted to show you a couple of examples. The first one is from the Old Testament. Pretty specific stuff about how you make restitution. So if we look at Exodus 22, verses 1 through 4, here's what Moses writes in the law. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If the thief is found breaking in, and he is struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. If the sun has risen on him, there shall be guilt for his bloodshed. So in other words, if the thief breaks in at night and you kill him, you're not guilty. But if the thief breaks in broad daylight and you can see it going on, I guess apparently you are guilty if you kill him. So that's an interesting sort of differentiation there. So yeah, make of that what you will. I don't know that we, in our age of electric lighting, I don't know that we would make those distinctions anymore. But you never know. Every state has a slightly different rule on that. Okay, so he should make full restitution. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. So in other words, restitution is required. If the theft is certainly found alive in his hand, so in other words, we're talking about livestock here. If we're caught with the sheep in our hand, whether it's an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall restore double. So if you take somebody's sheep, you got to give back 2 sheep. Now, the New Testament has the same kind of idea. Let's take a look at it though, because it's interesting how it goes down. And you're probably familiar with this story from Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10, and I'll read that for you. Then Jesus entered and passed through Jericho. Now behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, who was a chief tax collector. And we all know, by the way, that the tax collectors were the bottom of the social totem pole because they basically robbed people blind above and beyond what was required for the taxes. They extorted money from people basically, and they were not welcomed into polite society in any way. So anyway, he was the chief tax collector, and he was rich. Of course he would be rich, right? And he sought to see who Jesus was, but could not because of the crowd, for he was of short stature. So he ran ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was going to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him, and said to him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must stay at your house. So Zacchaeus made haste and came down, and received Jesus joyfully. But when they saw it, they all complained, saying, He has gone to be a guest with a man who is a sinner. You see how little tolerance people had for Jesus doing what Jesus did. Okay, in verse 8, Then Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I have taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold. Now, I want to mention a couple of things just in this, what he says here. He says, if I have taken anything from anyone by false accusation. I don't think there's any question but that he has. But so anyway, he says that. But the other thing that's interesting is that he says he restores fourfold. Now, you remember we just read about the sheep thing, right? If you're caught with the sheep that you stole, you have to restore it twofold. Now, what Zacchaeus is suggesting here is that he's going to go one better, and he's going to double that, and he's going to restore fourfold. That's pretty neat. So Jesus says to him, Today salvation has come to this house, because he is also a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. Now, this paragraph is very interesting because it leads to the other half of what we can do in the face of stealing, or what needs to be done, perhaps. We talked about restitution, in other words, giving back what you've stolen or giving back the value of what you've stolen. But what Jesus is saying here is more than that, right? This man has been restored. He's been saved because of what he's done. His change of heart, his change of attitude. Well, what we're really looking at here then is the other piece of what you do to combat stealing is restoration. So, because sometimes restitution is not enough to restore the relationship. Let's say Zacchaeus says, okay, I'm going to give back fourfold everything I've stolen, which, by the way, would probably leave him not all that rich after all by the time he got done doing that. But people in polite society would not want to hang out with him. They wouldn't receive him into their home. The relationship has not been restored. And oftentimes this would happen with us as well. If we know someone is a thief, we aren't going to trust them. The relationship is going to be fractured. We're not going to want them alone in our house. We're not going to loan them our car, whatever, right? We just don't trust them anymore. And that's very damaging, and that hurts God's heart. He doesn't like that. Restoration requires forgiveness. We need to forgive in order to restore the relationship. Just as, by the way, God has forgiven us. And we certainly are not entitled to that at all from our actions and what we have done. It's all because God has chosen to forgive us that we are forgiven. And I wanted to take a look here at Mark chapter 11, verses 25 and 26. Here's what Jesus says, And whenever you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive him, that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father in heaven forgive your trespasses. Now that's an important element, right? And what he's saying here basically is that why would you expect to be forgiven by God if you're not willing to forgive the people that have wronged you? I mean, certainly we've wronged Jesus in a big way, in a huge way. We've wronged God in many, many ways every day. And he's forgiven us. He's forgiven us, and we need to forgive our brother and sister. So the final thing I want to say here is that the Bible expresses God's heart for restitution and restoration, not just the I don't know, economic transactional kind of thing, with the stealing. Okay, you stole this and now I get this back, and that is good enough. That isn't good enough, because God wants to see that relationship be restored. So that's really kind of the key, I think, here for this entire commandment, that stealing is wrong, and even though we might in our hearts be willing to extend mercy to those who steal for quote-unquote justifiable reasons, right? The age-old example might be the boy who steals a loaf of bread because he's starving. And we might say, oh, that's not nearly as bad a sin as somebody who steals just for the fun of it, or on a dare, or because they're greedy, or whatever. Okay, but in the continuum of things, we've kind of created that, where we say some stealing is more justifiable than others. Or maybe even more. Let's think about the little boy again. He steals a loaf of bread, not for himself, but for his baby sister, who's even hungrier than he is. So we definitely would want to extend mercy and forgiveness to someone who does that. Now we need to realize that God's heart is even bigger than ours. We might be willing to extend forgiveness in those cases I just talked about, with the little boy stealing because of need and hunger. But God's heart is so big, he's willing to forgive the people who steal just for the fun of it, or just on a dare, or just because they're greedy. And that's something we need to understand, is that God has a heart of forgiveness, a heart of restoration. That's really what he's looking to do, is to restore, forgive, show mercy. And in his point of view, we're worth it, which I find totally astonishing. And I imagine that you do too. So the next time you just really are disappointed in yourself, that you just haven't been everything you wanted to be in a day, and how you've treated others, maybe what you've, I don't know, what you've said, what you've thought, just remember this. You are special to God, and his heart of forgiveness is huge. He is ready to extend mercy to us all. So on that note, why don't we pause and stop for the week and the day? I want you to have a blessed day and a blessed week, and I will see you again next Sunday.